Right. I've called this talk At a Snail's Pace, and you will in a moment see quite why. But first of all, here's the book. Some of you may have acquired it or at least seen it. And it was published, oh gosh, way back 4.5 years ago now, 5 years. And it seems an awful long time ago. But there's a history to this. I was invited to write it in 1997, taking over from my supervisor, who will appear later, Arthur Kane, who I think was invited to write one sometime in the 1970s and never got round to it. And I only contemplated stealing his patch, as it were, when it became apparent that he wasn't going to write it. So, what do you do when the new Naturalist series approaches you? They ask you to prepare a synopsis, a sort of set of chapter headings, if you like. I did that. It was accepted. In October of that year, I then had to submit a sample chapter some years later. They approved the chapter, so I signed the contract. At the millennium. So it took me 16 years to go from signing a contract to the book actually appearing in print. Now, in the book, I've recorded some speeds for slugs and snails, based on a variety of records, but the fastest conventional record for a snail comes from the famous Congham annual world snail races, and it clocked up a garden snail at 2.4 millimeters a second, which is one person sent me a faster record for for the invasive slug, Drosera invadens. So 2.4 millimeters a second. So there's a Naturalist going full tilt at a millimeter a second. The new Naturalist, if you stretch it out, is 8,500 centimeters long, which means I was writing at approximately 1,000th rate, or no, 6,000 times slower than the Naturalist can crawl. Now, of course, I wasn't spending all those 16 years writing. So, in summary, the process was not like this at all. It was like this. And to take you through that process and explain why it took so long and what happens, here are some background. First of all, the new Naturalist series. And I think most of you will be familiar with them. Very first new Naturalist on butterflies by E.B. Ford appeared just after the end of the Second World War. And I think it was part of a feeling of wanting to get back to normal and also to encourage good natural history writing. And you can see traces of patriotism. Editors believe that the natural pride of the British public in their native flora and fauna, etc. And this series very rapidly became popular among naturalists. And Collins, who were then the publishers, obviously knew they were onto a good thing. And it was followed by lots of other volumes, about 2 a year. And the topics were very widespread. It could be something like nature conservation. It could be based on an area like the Yorkshire Dales. It could deal with a group of animals like seabirds or grouse or whatever, or it could cover other topics altogether. But the specific remit was that it should be British. And the other specific remit was this was not an identification guide. It was they were keen to look at the natural history in a much more general sense. So you didn't use a key. You were writing about the biology and the natural history of an area or a group of animals or a group of plants. I have to put in a plug here because this is, you're looking at the only married couple who have both produced New Naturalists. And of course, it paid me immensely to have my wife, having gone through all the trials and tribulations of dealing with editing and proofreading and all the rest of it first. So yeah, at the moment, this is a unique event that a couple have both written a New Naturalist. Now, how did I get involved? Well, did my PhD at Manchester. I originally wanted to do birds, but the guy who I might have done birds with was busy having a nervous breakdown and sent me to Arthur Kane. And he was a bit chilly, didn't know me well. And then he discovered that my parents lived in Rickmansworth, northwest of London, which was famous for having a frost pocket, a cold valley where the temperature had almost gone down to freezing on a clear night in August. And because he was interested in climatic selection, he immediately turned me on to the snails, which he'd spent a lot of his time studying. So I went from this, the result of undergraduate expeditions, to this. You can't get more specific than that, can you? The distribution and variation of 3 species of land snail near Rickmansworth, Hertfordshire. And I have to say, so my ornithological career was cut short and I became a conchologist, but I have to say, that paper, more than 50 years old, has been cited twice in 2019. There you go. Few Turkish ornithologists have discovered the marvelous work I did as an undergraduate. Now, thanks to Arthur Kane, nearly half of all the work I've done professionally has been on variation in 2 species, Sapir nemoralis and Sapir hortensis. And earlier in the meeting, we saw one Sapir nemoralis. And this is all very well, but it isn't exactly the basis for writing a general New Naturalist. And what really turned me on to snails was, as PhD students, we could earn a bit of extra money by demonstrating on undergraduate field courses. And so I and my friend Jeremy Greenwood, who stuck with birds, produced a key to the local snail fauna of the Gower for the students and got them to start doing some surveys. Now, this is a historic document and I cannot find it anywhere. I have a fear that there are no copies survive. How did I do it? Basically, by using what was then the only standard guide to the British snails, published in 1926. I hope the Society will contemplate a centenary in the not too distant future, because it really is a historic work. It was revised, and Ellis himself, recalling it later, described it as a youthful indiscretion. Well, It led to another youthful indiscretion, because I produced with my wife first attempt I had at a more formal key, land snail, obviously out of date now. And of course, it led to the field guide, where I was very much the junior author. And I should add, A.E. Ellis compiled our index, so there was a lot of historical continuity here. Now, this is all very well. An identification guide is precisely not what a new naturalist should be about. And after that, and indeed before, nearly all my writing was in the form of short papers in academic journals dealing only with my own work. Of course, discussing other work around, nothing remotely like a new naturalist. So, okay, to start with, I was working in Britain. Then I started wandering about. You can see a rather more hirsute Cameron back in 1988 in the Kimberley, and in various countries in Europe, and asking very general questions which are of interest perhaps more to professional biologists. So when I started thinking about how am I writing this, well, one of my great heroes, because of his very good natural history skills as well as theoretical skills, was Sam Berry, who is well known for his work on mice and animals of that sort. And he wrote in his preface, the great joy of this sort of book, from the author's point of view, is that it does not have to be as inclusive and balanced as a textbook. The chapters that follow involve a selective and therefore idiosyncratic choice of topics and examples. Yes, I don't have to produce a textbook. So I prepared that synopsis way back in the 1990s. And I had to prepare my specimen chapter. And of course, I chose variation, where I could use all my knowledge about Sapir nemoralis and Sapir hortensis, and something which was easy to see how it would be illustrated. It was fun to write, and I sent it in, and I got a contract for the millennium, quite a long time ago now. But all sorts of things got in the way. I'll leave aside domestic family issues, which certainly impacted me. One thing that took up a lot of my time was the evolution megalab, and some of you may remember that, where precisely we were looking at variation in Sapir, and it was scheduled to run in 2009, but before that, we had to build up a database of all known records of the variation in those two species. And this involved going back through some unpublished notebooks, a vast number of papers, some museum collections, and often having to dig out old editions of Ordnance Survey maps in order to give a grid reference to a record merely with a place name. And all that map shows you all the historic records that were entered at the time. It gives you a biased picture because there were many more from France, but we couldn't access them at the time. But if I tell you that about 7,000 of those records were entered by me, often having to get out a map and work out a grid reference or a set of grid references, you'll understand why it took up quite a lot of time. It had one big defect. It meant that because we got masses of new information, that chapter I wrote became completely redundant. I had to rewrite it because there was so much new information. In between 2000 and 2016, research on slugs and snails has absolutely snowballed. It's amazing, go back to 2000, how many new and exciting things have been discovered. Firstly, and most obviously, molecular taxonomy has taken off. And one of the consequences of that is that what we previously regarded as nice, tidy little families of molluscs to explain have been rearranged in diagrams like this. So if you look at that, it is rather small, but previously Truncatolina and Columella were regarded as vertiginidae, for example. Now it appears that they're actually more closely related to, of all things, Zika, which is not at all closely related to Cochlicopa, despite the immense similarity in their shells. And this, of course, takes quite a lot of explaining to amateurs who may not bother unduly about families, but it's all, the effect goes right down to some cases where species have been split into more than one. Some species have been combined as a result of work using DNA. Next thing, which I haven't illustrated, huge progress in understanding how slugs and snails resist very, very hard frosts. The work of the French team, Ansart in particular, showing how snails survive over very cold winters. We know a lot more about dispersal. One ingenious experiment of by Francisco Velter-Schultes in releasing small Truncatolina in wind and finding how far they get blown. We know a lot more about pest control and disease. We know an awful lot about the function of darts and the way in which, as it were, they're used to inject hormones which predispose your partner to do her business properly as a female and not consume your sperm as a mid-mating snack. And a huge amount of new information has arisen from that. And island biogeography. Snails have played a very important role in looking at the effects of isolation, island age, island size, on the way we understand biogeography. And just to make the point, when I'd finished, I counted that I had actually given references to 260 items. Of course, I read many more. Nearly half were published after 2003. And the significance of that is that when I signed that contract in the year 2000, I was supposed to deliver a finished work by the year 2003. And just suppose I'd done that, the book would have been an antique. It would miss out an awful lot of things which have been discovered since. The other big change, which I appreciate when I look at earlier volumes, is technology. You can now insert color pictures however and wherever you want. There's really no limit to the numbers. They can be inserted in the text rather than the old-fashioned way of having a number of colour plates amassed in chunks in the middle of the book. So I'd done my reading. I was acquiring pictures. There was still that British requirement, which I felt was a huge restriction. And particularly when you consider, well, we know there are at least 25,000 species described, and probably at least double that number actually around, waiting to be, with more waiting to be found. But only 140 of them are known from the British Isles. And not only that, many of the interesting observations on natural history, on courtship, on mating, on feeding, on cold resistance, come from work done outside Britain. So I decided I was going to be a bit Bolshevik about this. I took a risk, and the synopsis I had in the end, and didn't show them, was completely, well, not completely, but quite a lot different from the version I'd originally submitted. Now, when you start to write a book like this and it's outside what I suppose you would call your comfort zone, you look for some models. Now, Ellis was more or less specifically descriptive identification. There's still the classic work by Edward Stepp. That's still mostly identification. And Alan Solom's nice little book, The Shell Makers, very good introduction. It covers the whole of the molluscs, not just global slugs and snails, but all the bivalves, all the cephalopods, and so on. So it wasn't a very good model. There were only the other new naturalists. And there's going to be no names, no backdrop here. There are some that are absolutely wonderful, like Oliver Rackham's books, for example. There are some which are deadly dull, and I'm not going to risk libel or slander by mentioning any names, but some are certainly much more attractive than others. So my original synopsis had some basic natural history. I then had the bit about the British fauna, and then the bit at the end about the interaction that slugs and snails have with us. I don't want to go down this list in detail, but I ended up not dividing it into sections, and I increased the number of chapters, and I avoided the use of the word British anywhere, although of course quite a lot of information necessarily comes from my own country. Now, of course, even though a book appears with just one author on the cover, it's not a solitary enterprise. Now, I don't have a picture of her, but my scientific editor for HarperCollins, Sally Corbett, was absolutely bloody marvellous. I would send her chapters, she would make very helpful comments. And I'm sure everything got an awful lot better because she picked out redundancies, she picked out bits of different chapters where I'd said the same thing all over again. She was absolutely marvellous. But two people, in addition, actually read everything in draft. Firstly, of course, my wife, and she was experienced in the field and could pick things up. Secondly, my Polish colleague, Beata Pokryszko, with whom I've authored many, many papers on European snails in general. The other thing I discovered is just how nice conchologists are, how friendly and how cooperative. The moment any people knew I was writing a book, I was inundated with offers when I put out an appeal for illustrations. And in the acknowledgement, I acknowledged 64 people from 16 countries, as well as permission from Conscioussoc itself to use maps from the Atlas. There are a few examples here, some of which I would never, ever have been able to photograph myself. And I have to say that having worked in an adult education department with people from different disciplines, I have to say that, for example, whereas all my malacological or conchological colleagues always been very cooperative, my brief example experience with archaeologists is that they were all at each other's throats all the time and would not part with information. But a book like this, where you can use a lot of illustrations, I could not have depended on my own resources. Some marvelous pictures there. Now, a few people who deserve some very special thanks. Richard Priest for endless patience with repeated drafts of snails in the past. I fear I've still got, perhaps not got some dating systems entirely intelligible, but it's not his fault, that's mine. And of course, our esteemed president. Again, you know, you can turn to an expert, and my chapter 11 involved a lot of material on conservation. And Martin was very helpful in all sorts of ways and gave me all sorts of leads into other information. Two other people who deserve mention for a slightly different reason. Andre Victor, name may not be known to all of you, but he was basically, I would say, Mr. Slug for Europe. An immensely learned man who has produced monographs on the slugs, not only in Europe, of different families of slugs, not only in Europe, but elsewhere. And when he knew I was writing the book, and I visited him after retirement, he showed me drawer after drawer of meticulous drawings that he had done. Nowadays, we might depend more on photography, but quantity of absolutely marvelous hand-drawn illustrations which he had produced, and absolutely generously said, Robert, use anything you want. And here are two pictures from the field guide. One of on the left of a Dordebardia eating an earthworm, like Testacella, but smaller. And on the other side, a spermatophore of a mylacid with those elaborate extensions, almost like sea anemones branching out along it. And then Adrian Norris. And apart from a lot of general information, because he was most of the time the non-marine recorder, gave me the fascinating story of this bee board, which he found photographed in Slovenia, and it reflects a widespread, I would say, folkloric story about tailors fighting snails. You can see the instruments of the trade. The man in the tree has got an old-fashioned iron and a pair of tailor's scissors. And this story occurs in rhymes in this country. It's quite widespread. And part of the origin of it is that tailors one of the very few male occupations which were sedentary and indoors. And because of this, tailors were supposed to be cowards. So even the prospect of fighting a snail caused tailors to run away in panic and fear. And the Slovenian rhyme, which accompanies this particular illustration, it's decidedly scatological as the tailors panic in their running away from the snail. And that leads me to what was at the end of the book, the uses of slugs and snails, practical, symbolic, poetic and recreational. And I have to say, biologist though I am, this was the most fun both to write and to research. And one story which cropped up again and again in medieval manuscripts are pictures of men-at-arms, knights or whatever, panicking at the sight of a snail, dropping their weapons, or even bowing down in apparent surrender to a snail. Now, there's a long and complicated explanation for this, which I'm not going to go into now, but one of the nicest illustrations is this one from a manuscript in the Bodleian Library, and you can see a person looking up and seeing a snail and panicking, dropping his shield and his sword. And I've used this regularly when I've given more scientific talks about a theoretician surprised by a snail. In other words, that classic instance of a beautiful theory slain by a sordid fact. And I do this to remind my mathematical colleagues sometimes that I can go out into the field and find something which they're totally incapable of explaining. Reality is scary, I think, is the short way of putting that. And to end up with, you keep on coming across examples which give me a sense of fun and enjoyment. It doesn't stop. The one right at the top right, I happen to be in giving a talk in Lisbon, and there in the street was a van with this enchanting snail advertising its wares. In Greece, I found Snail Soap on sale, and you may have heard that snail or slug mucus is supposed to remove your wrinkles. You can tell, but if you can see my face clearly, you can see I haven't been using it since I have a good dose of wrinkles. And you keep on finding little snippets of information about the strange way in which we react to slugs and snails. And that is that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Robert.
I will.
And you're just being switched off, I think, by Imogen. Yep, yes. We're back. So thank you very much. That was a fascinating and wide-ranging talk. And yes, I mean, I've read your book in detail. I had to review it for British Wildlife, so I know every word, which was a pleasure to do. Right, next, any questions, comments, please? Go ahead. Right, Ron.
Hello, Robert. Interesting talk. Did the value of your contract increase with the elapsed time?
No.
I thought possibly not.
Let me put it this way. I'm not going to reveal any deeply sordid financial details, but let's put it this way. If I work out the total earnings, I'm earning something like 1/10 of the national minimum wage per hour. It is not your way to fame and fortune.
Would anybody else like to comment?
Yeah, I would like to ask a question to Robert. Start video.
Hello, Aidan.
Yeah. Hello, Robert. I missed the beginning of your talk. Has the book been published?
Yes, in
Okay.
2016.
Oh, okay. Wow, I'm far behind. Okay.
a long time ago.
I haven't come across any reviews of it. I guess that's why
Something went. I am a little bit aggrieved about that, in that copies which should have been sent to various outlets were not sent, and I discovered this too late. So that was something I had a bit of a grievance with the publishers for. And I was very grateful to Martin, and there was one other who managed to squeeze a review into an appropriate place. It was sad.
Right, yes. Now I can send you a review, which is obviously highly complimentary.
Thank you.
Yeah. If you're interested, Aidan, if you give me if I get your email address.
Absolutely, because I had virtually no formal feedback from the publishers. And I have to say, way back at the time of the field guide, which is a very long time ago, but the same publisher, they were very prompt in those days to send you copies of all reviews they knew about. This time, absolutely nothing. I fear it's a result of the Murdoch takeover.
You did.
Right, thank
well.
you. I will try to look it up and order a copy.
Thank you very much.
Yep, they're getting expensive now. They're collector's items.
I think, I think you will find if you search around, they seem to offer a very large number of copies at quite substantial discounts. I never got my mind around the marketing strategy which they use, which seems to me to be extremely complicated.
Yes, autographed copies have come at a premium, don't they? Anyway,
maybe.
right. Do I have anybody else who would like to contribute a comment or a question? I cannot see anybody. So, right, at this point, I would like you to unmute yourself, please. So could you everybody unmute there? And I would like us to, in the traditional face-to-face meeting style, Rupert, you need to unmute and offer a round of applause.
Thank you.
So thank you very, very much, Robert, and that was well worth the wait, the year's wait because of the COVID crisis. So thank you very, very much indeed, and I will now pass on to the closing